Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Let's begin. This is the panel 12 on social movements, resisting racial, gendered, and economic injustices through community organizing. Um, well, you can see my name. So we have our four panelists here today who are going to present, and I'm just going to introduce them. Each one will have up to 12 minutes to comment, and then we'll have the discussants' brief comments, and then we'll get into your questions. Please put your questions into the chat, and I'll do my best to integrate them. The questions will be, we'll respond to questions at the end of all the presentations, okay? Um, so let's not lose any time. And let me put my little stopwatch thing on for 12 minutes. And so we'll begin with this paper, A Chorus of Voices. This is Shamya. It's Shamya, right? Not Samia.
Shamya.
Shamya, and you just told me that too. It's Shamya Hutchinson, and she's at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. Oh, you're in Pennsylvania with me. Okay. And this was on, the title is A Choice of Voices, Tarana, Burke, and Healing the Collective Trauma of Sexual Violence. So if you would please, Dr. Hutchinson.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shamya Hutchinson, and I'm a graduating senior at Lincoln University studying psychology and human services. And I'm really passionate about sexual violence prevention. And I'm actually one of the first organizations on campus. I created an organization on campus around sexual violence. So I'm really passionate about this work. And I actually pre-recorded my presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen and we can watch it together. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Today, I will be presenting my research entitled A Chorus of Voices, Tarana, Burke, and Healing the Collective Trauma of Sexual Violence. Today, we will be covering the introduction to my project, Sexual Violence Prevention as a Movement, my research methods, the summary of my literature review, my findings and conclusions, my bibliography, and the acknowledgements of my project. My research focuses on the methods and philosophies used by Tarana Burke in the Me Too movement to tell a larger narrative about sexual violence broadly and Black women in particular. Sexual violence against Black women has long been an overlooked topic in this country. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, grassroots organizations began to stress the importance of a cultural shift regarding violence against women. It was not until 1994 the Violence Against Women's Act, a federal policy was passed due to the tireless organizing headed by Black women to recognize sexual violence as a public health issue. Tarana Burke, founder of the Me Too movement, alongside other Black women, fight diligently to put an end to the pervasive nature of sexual violence in the United States and abroad. My research explores the methods that are utilized by Burke within her organization to dismantle rape culture, sexual violence, and gender-based violence. Rape culture can be defined as an environment where sexually violent acts against people, especially women, are excused and normalized. My research has a 3-point framework. 1, Blackness, sexual violence, and gender. 2, the relationship between Black women's experience with sexual violence historically and currently. And 3, the study of sexual violence prevention and what activism looks like in the contemporary moment for survivors. Sexual violence can be defined as any sexual act by way of force or coercion against another person, regardless of relationship to that person. Once given the opportunity to interview with Tarana Burke, some of the questions I would like to ask her are, how do we collectively heal from the trauma of sexual violence? I believe it's important to understand what collectively healing looks like and understand how we can better assist in creating a shift in culture. Another question I would like to ask her is, In an interview, she stated that joy comes in the morning and in the morning. And I really wanted to know what was her inspiration for that statement and what message she was trying to convey to survivors by saying this. The last question, and the most important question I would love to ask her is, as a Black woman, what are some things you do to care for yourself? I think it's extremely important as Black women and Black activists to understand how to take care of ourselves and be very intentional of how we practice self-care and how that shows up in our work and how us taking care of ourselves is able to transfer over to the people that we are working with. So that's a very important question I would love to ask her once given the opportunity. My study builds on a plethora of sources, which I will talk about shortly, to represent a wide range of sexual violence prevention efforts. Similar to others who study and organize around Blackness and sexual violence have stated, Tarana Burke, through centralizing Black women, actively brings to the fore the origins of sexual violence prevention movement. My work draws on the earliest documented efforts to confront and organize around sexual violence against women. The first women in the United States to insist on breaking the silence around violence against women were African American. Frances Thomas, a transgender woman, alongside 4 other Black women, testified before Congress following the Memphis riots in 1866. This moment was the catalyst of the movement. Beginning in the 1870s, Black women kickstarted the anti-rape movement. Most notably, Ida B. Wells, for organizing anti-lynching and anti-rape campaigns alongside countless other Black women who decided to take leadership roles in this work. The efforts of these women led to the creation of the Black Women's Club movement in the late 1890s. The Black Women's Club focused on social and political reform and would later become the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. This organization went on to lay the groundwork for national organizations such as the First State Coalition Against Domestic Violence in Pennsylvania. The second wave of the sexual violence prevention movement began in the late 1960s and early 1970s, pushed mostly by the civil rights and student-led organizations. My research draws from historical policy research, social media research, primary sources, and secondary sources. I examine historical policies based on sexual violence prevention in the United States and the origin of these policies. I utilize this research to display the connection between organizing in that time and policies that were passed. I put a timeline starting from the Declaration of Title IX in 1972 to the Violence Against Women's Act in 1994, highlighting the Violence Against Women's Act as a critical turning point for policy regarding sexual violence prevention in Black women. In 1972, Title IX was enacted as a follow-up to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The 1964 Act was passed to end discrimination in various fields based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Title IX prohibits discrimination based on sex by educational institutions that receive federal funding. Over time, these laws will include protecting students from gender-based sexual violence. In 1984, the Victims of Crime Act was passed to assist survivors with the tangible cost of surviving a crime, such as medical bills, counseling services, and lost wages. A critical turning point in policy arrived in 1994 with the Violence Against Women Act. Violence Against Women Act authorized funds to establish a national domestic violence hotline and to support women's shelters, rape prevention education, and coordinated community responses to domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. This is the first known policy around sexual violence in the nation that was informed by the work of Black women. But once it reached the policy level, the Black women focus was removed. Additionally, I studied interviews and stories involving Tarana Burke in the Me Too movement from 2015 to 2020. I examined the social media pages of the Me Too movement during the summer of 2020. I looked for the relationship between sexual violence prevention and the new abolitionist model for defunding the police. I wanted to highlight how Me Too included survivors at this critical moment in history. I examined the Facebook and Instagram accounts of the Me Too movement, where they displayed this statement: sexual misconduct is the second highest form of police misconduct in the nation after excessive force, a fact that very few people know. They use their platform to educate their audience on sexual violence as it relates to police misconduct. When examining their Twitter account, the objective there was different. They pushed the agenda to engage with their audience on Twitter and center the stories of survivors by way of dialogue. My project pulls from interviews and studies on Tarana Burke and the mission of the Me Too movement. Through studying Burke, 4 themes become apparent: the relationship between organizing and policymaking. Chan, Jaffe, and Murphy display the importance of giving all people access to a healing journey, ensuring Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic survivors are protected and heard. Murphy, Lopez, and Alabi reinforced that Me Too is not about taking down the rich and powerful, but supporting and recognizing survivors. Burbaum and Sherwood ensure the value of keeping sexual violence as a part of the national conversation. In sum, Tarana Burke propels the movement of sexual violence prevention for Black women and girls by emphasizing the importance of censoring them in the Me Too movement. Operating with the philosophies of radical community healing and empowerment through empathy, Burke is an asset to the third wave of sexual violence prevention movement. Making clear the importance of statements such as all the ways sexual violence is allowed to flourish in our communities, we want to work against that. Burke works diligently to reduce erasure of Black women in sexual violence prevention work, a movement in which they pioneer because she understands what happens when we are removed. Moreover, this study can be used to consider different ways to approach sexual violence in the 21st century. New policy findings reveal that policy alone cannot end the pervasive nature of sexual violence. There must be a cultural shift in the way society views sex and humans. Burke argues that sexual violence is a national problem and it's not enough to create awareness, but more important is what is done with that awareness. This study can also help push policymakers to focus on prevention and comprehensive sex education while holding sexual violence to the same degree as they do other public health issues. And here's my bibliography. I'm happy to send this to anyone who may be interested in looking at it further. I would like to take the time to acknowledge everyone who made this project possible and that informed my work. And lastly, I would just like to remind you all to continue to show up for survivors and continue to work against the pervasive nature of sexual violence whenever you may see it. So thank you so much for listening to my project, and I hope that you learned something new.
So thank you everyone for listening to my project. I hope that you learned something new, and I'm excited to interact with you all in the question and answer portion.
Okay, thank you very much, Shamya. And that was right at 12:58. And I remember I said we want to keep it to 12 minutes, but remember they're 59 seconds in a minute, okay? So it's still excellent. And especially as you got the acknowledgements in there as well, that was wonderful and very informative. Thank you so much. So now we're going to have our second presenter, Allison Baymer. And this is, did I pronounce the last name correctly? Okay. And this presentation is on worker cooperatives as challenges to racial hierarchy in the US. So please, Allison, please.
Alrighty, can everybody see? Awesome. So my name is Allison Baymer, and I'm a second year PhD student at UC San Diego. And what I'm presenting here today is a first cut at my seminar paper project. So I'm very excited for feedback today. So I want to start this talk with some statistics on the state of work and labor in the US. And they're intended to demonstrate how the vulnerabilities and exploitations experienced in the US labor market are racialized. And these motivating examples should be kept in mind throughout as they exemplify the problem from which I will argue worker cooperatives can liberate Black workers and workers of color. Oops. So this graph tells us that about 1.5 and 1.4 million Black and Hispanic Latinx workers respectively experienced a minimum wage violation in 2017, earning less than $15,000. This graph on the left shows, in the center, this graph shows differences in benefits given to those in service industry versus all other industries. So as of January 2021, over a quarter of Black women worked in the service industry, implying that they're disproportionately harmed by the lack of benefits shown in this graph. Now, finally, this image on the left shows the large wage gap experienced by Indigenous women. And then on the right, we have some survey results from a study on migrant worker conditions, which show that, for example, about 35% of those surveyed reported not having the safety equipment they needed to do their jobs. So with these examples of workplace abuse and exploitation in mind, I'm going to quickly walk through the presentation outline. So first, I'm going to define the main problem in which I am interested here, which is that traditional work in capitalist America upholds racial domination. Then I'll propose a theory of worker cooperatives as capable of challenging the relations of domination and production that uphold white supremacy. Then provide some preliminary evidence from the Bay Area that worker co-ops are doing just that in practice. They're conceiving of themselves as challenges to hegemonic race and class structures. So now I'm going to work towards more precisely defining the problem. So a lot of conceptual work has gone into defining what exactly the problem is with capitalist relations. And what I present here is a formulation of that. So this shows a conceptual relationship with economic exploitation on the left and domination on the right. So on the left, we see economic exploitation developing from the fact that in relations of production, the capitalist, or A, has structural power over the worker, B. So A takes advantage of this power over B in a way that treats B as a means rather than an end. And this results in a relation of production wherein the worker is subject to the will of the employer. And this is, I think, a useful way of thinking about this relationship because it highlights the structural power relations that cause and govern this dynamic, the cloud looming above, but also that dynamics within the workplace perpetuate this domination-based relationship. So now the labor relationship that I just described is, of course, situated in the particular racial context of the US. So we must understand this relationship as intersectional, and that it involves class and race-based dynamics that mutually uphold this labor system and are not severable from each other. So to understand this, I start with two givens, the first being white supremacy is hegemonic, by which I mean that as an organizational structure for society, it has developed to the point where it reproduces itself through political, economic, social systems rather than outright coercion. And the second given is the racialized nature of capitalism. By which I refer to the stolen labor of enslaved Black people on which the country was built, the forced subjugation of Indigenous populations for profit, the continuing racial division of labor that deems populations of color as better suited for manual and service jobs, and as well as the legal and institutional efforts to keep separate racial and labor interests. So we take as a given capitalism as racialized. And so while the problem of relations of production thought of in this way produces inequalities in which we're interested, I'm interested here today in studying alternative paradigms to these relations of production that can help transform not only how we think about work and labor in the US, but can help to challenge racial domination. So I argue that an alternative work paradigm must address the intersectional nature of labor relations. And I propose a theory of worker co-ops as capable of doing just that. So what are worker co-ops? So structurally, they prioritize workers' needs ahead of profits and usually arise in response to community need and market failures. So workers own the business. Earnings are redistributed to them rather than shareholders, and each member or worker has a vote. So in sum, we can think of them as democratically run, worker-owned businesses that hypothetically remove hierarchy from labor relations within the workplace and upset wealth distributions outside the workplace. So the Democracy at Work Institute's 2019 report showed that there are at least 465 worker co-ops in the US, which employ over 6,000 workers. And additionally, they report that most worker owners are Black and people of color. So quite a few folks have studied worker co-ops despite their relatively small size. So the first chunk of text on the screen talks about scholars that have focused mostly on the democratic component of worker co-ops. So I'm going to hone in on this third point that's bolded here, that some folks have used Republican theory or labor republicanism and relational egalitarianism to justify workplace democracy because it removes workers from the arbitrary will of employers. However, these accounts are largely silent on the intersectional nature of the US labor market that we've just discussed. So now I turn to two prominent works that explicitly incorporate the intersectional nature of the labor system. So Jessica Gordon Nembhard's extensive and career-long study of the cooperative movement within the Black African American community has traced the cooperative tradition, worker co-ops and beyond, to thinker activists such as Du Bois, Garvey, and Boehmer, to name just a few. And she's reconstructed this rich cooperative tradition within the Black community from, importantly, the standpoint of economic development, arguing that worker co-ops serve as an alternative means through which populations who are strategically excluded from markets can produce wealth and engage economically. Now, Ibarra, Carlos, and Torres build on her work to interpret cooperatives as a, quote, counter-hegemonic program that can transform capitalism into something else. So they extend Gordon Nembhard's argument to say that worker cooperatives engage in what is a double project of seeking a better standard of living for workers in the short term, and also offering a vision of a radical economic democracy that challenges the existing hegemony of white supremacy upheld by capitalism in the long term. So I see my theoretical contribution as trying to merge these two approaches to studying worker co-ops. So that is, I theorize that worker cooperatives, in the language of labor Republicans listed here on the left, upset relations of domination by, one, redistributing wealth to workers, which decreases conditions that lead to economic exploitation, and two, giving decision-making powers to workers to ensure that the enterprise tracks their interests. However, I want to push this insight to include the racialized nature of the labor system, arguing that in doing this, by disrupting power relations within and outside the workplace, worker co-ops counter white supremacy as hegemonic. They counter one of the realities that it relies on, that economic and labor systems will replicate racial hierarchy. And in the place of a racialized hierarchy of labor, worker co-ops offer democratized horizontal power relations. So in both practice and the abstract, they challenge norms of hierarchy and subordination, which work to buttress white supremacy. So ultimately, in offering an alternative paradigm to work, and by emphasizing worker ownership, dignity, and participation, worker co-ops offer a challenge to white supremacy as racial hegemony. Now, I do not argue that worker co-ops are a panacea for white supremacy. In fact, Ibarra et al. Find instances of racial paternalism and hierarchy replication, particularly in multiracial co-ops. And because they still very much operate within a capitalist system, they're oftentimes incentivized to drive up prices so that they can pay their workers dignified wages. And this is noted as contributing to gentrification. But what I do argue here is that in comparison to traditional relations of production, worker co-ops offer a promising paradigm shift toward a fuller expression of democracy than we currently have. So if my theory of worker co-ops as a challenge to racial hegemony is correct, then we should observe in practice worker co-ops as articulating their purposes as such. So they should use language, or they should talk about the intersectional nature of race and class and labor relations because they're uniquely positioned to challenge both. So I turn now to evidence to support this theory using the Bay Area worker co-op community as a case study. So on the left of the screen here are the two questions I pursued. One, do worker co-ops talk about themselves as challenging the dual nature of labor relations? And if they do that, what are some patterns as to how they do it? So I located 47 worker co-ops in the Bay Area and pulled all substantive language from their websites. I then went through each co-op, pulling language that addressed the questions I've listed here, which we can think of as my coding scheme. So in sum, this scheme allows me to evaluate how and the extent to which they talk about race and class as intersectional and how their structure can address both. So there's a lot of text here, but you're not meant to read it. I just want this to show that of the 47 Bay Area worker co-ops I analyzed, 11 talk about race and class in the way I just described. So this may seem small, but I argue that it's notable when we recall that the growth of co-ops is happening within mostly Black worker and people of color worker owned co-ops. And given that the majority of the co-ops I found using this type of language are owned by Black workers and workers of color, this means we might expect this trend to grow. So in sum, to address question 1 on the previous slide, yes, about a quarter of worker co-ops in my sample conceive of themselves as challenging both racial and class hegemony. We can talk more about how I coded this in Q&A if you'd like. Now, how do they do this? What are some of the patterns? So I separate out the language they use to talk about the problems, and this is on the left-hand column, and the solutions on the other 2 columns related to the interconnectedness of race and class and work. So in discussing the problems caused by this interconnectedness, they separate out by those who talk about it as a structural or systemic problem, and those describe it as more circumstantial or particular. So those talking about capitalism as a system or systemic interconnected inequalities of race and economics landed co-ops in the structural camp. Language like low income or struggles faced by a certain racial group would fall under particular because they're not making claims that an overarching system necessarily caused these racialized economic experiences. Now on the solution side, a pattern emerged with respect to whether the solutions they prescribed were personal or collective in nature. So reference to personal sovereignty or improvements for just their workers characterized conceiving of solutions as personal in nature. And then on the collective side, co-ops that talk about collective wealth or improving conditions for an entire class of people put them in this camp. So finally, I noticed a pattern in the specific types of solutions they propose, those that are describing wealth and stability and economic growth, and those that talked about the conditions of work as needing to be dignified and humane. So I hope today that I've adequately directed attention to worker co-ops as a challenge to the intersectional nature of the problem of capitalist labor relations, and hopefully I've provided some evidence of them doing this. Now going forward, I want to explicitly incorporate what I think has been implicitly looming throughout the entire project, and that's the role of gender. And then through the Democracy at Work Institute, I actually have access to an individual level survey of worker co-op members that I hope to explore. So thank you very much for your time, and I really look forward to your feedback.
I was still muted. I'm sorry. Thank you, Allison Baymer, for that presentation. And I'm going to move on to I think I'm next. Let me just. I'm no multitasker. Okay. So our next presenter is Errol Henderson, and he's going to present his paper. Was a work in progress. It's called "As Quiet as It's Kept: Save Our Sons and Daughters and Black Women's Roots of the Million Man March." And I'm going to start my time. So to show that I actually prepared something, this is a work in progress that I'm having a lot of difficulty writing, partly because of the subject matter. But let me share with you the orientation of the work, okay? And actually, I don't recommend that we read our work, but I want to keep my union card. And since I don't have a physical paper, I want to do that. So I said this essay encourages a reassessment and reconsideration of resistance and revolution through an analysis of African-American women's leadership and activism in the US Rust Belt of the 1980s. In so doing, it situates Black Lives Matter in its historical precursor, the urban peace and justice movement of the 1980s and 90s in the US, which emerges mainly in the Rust Belt cities of Detroit, Chicago, Minneapolis, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh, before coordinating with movements south, west, and to the mid-Atlantic. Central to the urban peace and justice movement was the Detroit-based grassroots organization Save Our Sons and Daughters, SOSAD, founded by Clementine Barfield, a city worker whose teenage son had been murdered outside a Detroit high school. SOSAD became linked with the Atlanta-based Mothers of Murdered Sons, founded by Brenda Muhammad, whose son also had been killed. Actually, Sister Muhammad would change the organization once she meets Ms. Barfield to Mothers of Murdered Sons and Daughters. The Urban Peace and Justice Movement, SOSAD linked with groups organizing gang truces in Los Angeles, preceding the 1992 rebellion in that city, after the acquittal of white policemen filmed beating Black motorist Rodney King. Central among the latter was Brenda Meredith's Mothers Reclaiming Our Children, Mothers Rock. The Urban Peace and Justice Movement highlighted the institutional incapacity of the US justice system and the unwillingness of US political leaders to take sufficient actions to provide for the physical security of its citizens, especially its children, particularly its Black children. The Urban Peace and Justice Movement viewed institutions of public security, that is local police, jails and prisons, public health and education, as not only deficient in their provisions of meaningful public service, but white supremacists as well. This combination warranted fundamental and ostensibly revolutionary changes in these systems in the United States. Yet the work of the Urban Peace and Justice Movement, especially of the Black women survivors who were instrumental in it, is underappreciated by many current activists and many academics, even as they attempt to address many similar challenges. So this is what I want to talk about, this movement, the Urban Peace and Justice Movement. And in particular, the group Save Our Sons and Daughters, which was started by Clementine Barfield, as I alluded to before. And it's interesting, Clementine Barfield was a city worker who was, like many Detroiters, came from the South. Many Detroiters come from, well, you know where Detroiters come from. The regions that were just south of us, they just followed the train north. A lot of us from Alabama, more Alabama than Mississippi, but she's in Mississippi. And Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee, and those states. She's from Mississippi. And one of the things that struck me when Ms. Barfield, who's presently writing a memoir on this history, and what I'm trying to do is provide a political analysis of what was going on at the time. And when Ms. Barfield comes up to the north as a teenager, she's struck by some of the differences and some of the continuities, some of the discontinuities and continuities that she finds in Detroit. For example, when she gets to Detroit as this northern city, she finds that in school, they're still using the same book, this decrepit school book, and here I mean decrepit not in its look, but in its quality, that she was using in Mississippi. The same awful textbook, she said. But she's struck because she's a Mississippi girl, as she would say it. She learns to go to their school, she has to cross Grand River. And she was struck. So her and her little brother walked to Grand River. And if you've ever been to Detroit, Detroit's, the east and west of Detroit is dissected by a street called Woodward Avenue. Detroiters, we do east side and west side. You know, like Chicago, there's really no south, there's no east side. We say south side, west side, north side. In Detroit, it's east side and west side. So if you hear somebody saying South Detroit, they're not from Detroit, or they are recently re-gentrified from them. So we say east side, west side. So the Woodward separates east from west. The main thoroughfare headed out east is Gratiot. The main thoroughfare headed out west is Grand River. Miss Barfield is told as a teenager, her and her little brother have to go to the school. To go to school, they have to cross Grand River. She gets to where her parents told her she had to go, and she's looking for a boat because she's from Mississippi, and she needs a boat to cross Grand River. And she doesn't understand why her mother didn't afford her one. Because they would row, they're very rural in Mississippi. So when she got there, she sees all these cars, she's traumatized at that point. And it's interesting that she would eventually come home and realize that Grand River is a street. It's not a grand river that she had to cross with a boat. So her mother wasn't misleading her. She actually thought her mother was playing a trick on her. The irony of Grand River is when her 17-year-old son, Derek, is shot and killed in 1986, he's right off Grand River outside of Northwestern High School. Miss Barfield's daughter, Linda, after Derek is killed, says, we just can't let them kill Derek like that. And what Ms. Barfield does next is astounding. In 1987, in January, she builds in the bloodshed of her child, an organization called Save Our Sons and Daughters. The organization is set up around what was called a Survival Institute, teaching survival skills to young folks, bereavement support, because she recognized that many of the parents were just walking wounded, or some of us call the dead unburied. They're almost zombie-like because many folks are not expecting to bury their children. And a crisis intervention team. She comes up with this. She's a worker in the city. She didn't plan on any of this. And it's important to put this in the context of the 1980s. This is the Reagan era. Reagan relights the Cold War. This is an era that could be called the era from one Yusuf to the next Yusuf. That is the killing of Yusuf Bell in Atlanta, that signals the Atlanta child murders, to the killing of Yusuf Hawkins in New York at the end of the decade. It's the era of where AIDS becomes prominent, and AIDS activism as well. It's also the era of Black political mobilization around the Rainbow Coalition, this time of Jesse Jackson, but before that was Harold Washington in Chicago. There's a lot of political activism. Oprah Winfrey becomes prominent. One of the ways she becomes prominent, she interviews people in Forsyth County, Georgia, who accosted Black folks who were marching through there. Then Oprah goes to Forsyth County. Also, Beulah May Donnell sues the United Klans of America for the lynching of her son, Michael Donnell. There's a lot of activism going on as well. In this context, Ms. Barfield and others are going to argue for the importance of Black children. I want you to get a sense of this. I'm an international relations scholar. What Ms. Barfield is saying is that she's entering into a discussion that we would call in international relations human security. She's saying, what right does this government have to continue to preside over us if they can't provide for the basic human rights of the most vulnerable citizens, Black children? And that's what's fundamental. She commits what's, for some, pun intended, a cardinal sin. Ms. Barfield has divorced the preacher. The preachers would allow her to bereave, to grieve only. And if you're Ms. Barfield, she's not going to accept grieving only. She organizes with Vera Rucker, whose daughter Melody was killed at her Sweet 16 party. And they both start this organization. The organization itself is important. It's central to the urban peace and justice movement. But look at who organizes with Ms. Barfield. Some early Detroit rappers. She's appealing to young folks. And Detroit rap doesn't start with Eminem. Eminem from across 8 Mile. He's not from this side of 8 Mile. Detroit's northern boundary is 8 Mile Road. He's from across 8 Mile. But people like Prince Vince in the Hardcore Committee, Mike Fresh, Chaos and Maestro. Chaos and Maestro is the second major a rap group, Detroit rap group to make the Billboard Top 100 and also to play Joe Louis Arena. But look who else gravitates toward Ms. Barfield. Ron Scott. Ron Scott is the founder of Detroit's Black Panther Party back in 1968. Who else? Old line revolutionists, James and Grace Lee Boggs. James is on the board of Save Our Sons and Daughters, and Grace Lee Boggs is the editor. Volunteers include one of the founders of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, General Baker. What brought these disparate folks to this, to Clementine Barfield? Student and community activists rallied around her in this in this mission to save our sons and daughters. Ms. Barfield would argue, she would say, we knew what we were against, this type of killing. And we set up memorials, we set up peace programs. All right, I jumped ahead. But she asked, what were we for? We know what we're opposed to, what are we for? And it was Ron Scott of the Black Panther Party. He came up with it. He said, we're for peace. But to have peace, you have to have justice. And to just focus on this, to look at peace and the fight for peace, and to tie that into justice, ramified into this broader movement. Now, I want to be I'm conscious of time. So I think I'm about to stop. But I want to say what Ms. Barfield did was a legacy that's as important as is underappreciated. And I'm working on this piece just to bring this more to light. And I think one of the reasons it's underappreciated and understudied, because she was in the leadership of a movement that was largely formed by Black women who refused to choose to only grieve. I'll stop there. See, I was at 11 and 20 seconds, so I want y'all to know I'm not. So I'll stop there. Let me now turn to our last presenter, and this is Claire Crawford. Claire Crawford is going to present on "We'll Never Turn Back: The Albany Movement and Sounds of Freedom." So please, Claire Crawford.
Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Claire Crawford. I'm a third year in the Political Science International Relations program at USC. So today's presentation that you're going to see is kind of like the inspiration for my dissertation. It's a paper I wrote last year and over the summer edited and through the fall edited. So I'm just pulling out from a piece of that. I guess to start off, just to think about where this comes from. So thinking about why singing freedom in Albany. I am originally from Lithonia, Georgia, and my family's from Southwest Georgia, Dawson and Camilla, Georgia. And Albany is the major city in that area. And so spent a lot of time there for the past 2 years, just because grandparents getting older, and so having to like visit the South more often. So this is how I get to being interested in visiting the Albany Civil Rights Institute there. All right, I'm gonna share my screen here. And so I intend to let the folks who were there tell the story as I then add in and comment. So this will include a lot of quotes, but I'll read them. So thinking about Albany and how the Albany movement came to be, the Albany movement is a movement that happened from around mid 1961 to 1963. It's kind of like the historical period and ending. So why Albany was chosen is it is first chosen by SNCC. So SNCC in 1960 had a pretty successful campaign of sit-ins. Atlanta was pretty popping in 1960, and they said, let's go further south. And so this was kind of like the motivation for them going further south. So Albany was picked for a voter registration campaign to return to the source of people's agony, that area which was the heart of the slave plantation system, a city surrounded by the past, right? And so what you have here on the picture, you have Charles Sherrod, who is actually a native of he comes down to Albany, and he's around 20 years old, and he basically stays in Albany after this, but this is him speaking to folks in kind of outside of the city of Albany and getting them to think about registering to vote. And so something that is very interesting, particularly of the Albany movement and why we don't hear about it in our civil rights movement history, is because it's considered a failure. And so a lot of these are kind of the reasons for why it's considered a failure. So the campaign goal was too large. This is one of the first times that you have multiple organizations coming in. What you'll notice a lot is you'll have like SNCC in one place, you'll have SCLC and MLK in another place, and you'll have another organization somewhere else. What you have here is you have NAACP, SNCC, SCLC, and you also have a local coalition. And they're all coming in trying to do different things. And at the time, they wanted to desegregate the entire city, right? And so even though this is a small town, we're talking no more than about 2,000 Black folks, maybe like 10,000 people exactly in the city, that was still too large. And so this is early within kind of our civil rights movement history. And so there was inexperience between these organizations and working together. There's plenty of missed opportunities in collaborating with locals. They're not really motivating people. They were counter mobilizing against one another. So they were like helping each other get arrested, telling the city where this group was meeting, letting people know who was staying. And so the leadership, right? And so this moment for MLK is important because he says this can never happen again. And he writes about this in his own early works. In every autobiography by a SCLC person, this is his turning moment. Like, what does it mean to be MLK? And by that, at this point, media was just following him. He didn't really know how to use the media at this moment. He would get arrested, but he hadn't made any promises, so they would just release him. And also something that happened in Albany that's really important is the white power structure was considered kind, right? So they arrested them in kind ways. There was no Birmingham blasting tactical, they would let them, as you see here, this is a cover from an album, but they would let them pray in front of the city hall. And then they would just escort them into to jail. And what they did also that helped was that they pulled people apart. So they sent people to other counties. So Albany's in the county called Dougherty County. They would send people to this county called Terrible terrible Mitchell County or like Mad Mitchell. So these other places where they would like, where protesters would encounter and demonstrators would encounter police brutality, but not in the limelight of media, not by Albany police. And they treated essentially King like he was allowed to have visitors in jail. They gave him whatever he wanted when he was in jail. They treated him basically like a political prisoner and not more so in ways he was treated in other places. And so these are all things that contribute to the failure of this movement. It just never really came together. And so it's remembered as a lesson learned, as a testing ground. But something that I'm impressed by in this story is what we understand as songs of freedom songs really come out of this. They really change here in this present moment. And no one really talks about that. And so that's something that really motivated me. And so thinking about why I believe there's this aesthetic political boundary, using a lot of work by Richard Iden, particularly the Black Search of the Black Fantastic, thinking about, of course, his work focuses on post-civil rights, but really thinking about like, how do we even get to thinking about post-civil rights? So the nation state is not the only and final frontier when we consider freedom. And something that he states is that the goal is to highlight the possible ways a deep engagement with popular culture might enhance our understanding of developments in the formal political arena, and to suggest that greater attention to a fuller range of deliberative practices and spaces might compel a revision of our notions of the political. So really just expanding the political here and thinking about taking the aesthetic out of Blackface. So we know that the aesthetic exists, and oftentimes the Black aesthetic is considered outside of. And so if the aesthetic is understood as a science of beauty that forecloses substantive political engagement or challenge, it must be recognized as a key brick in the wall of modernity and one of the cornerstones of the racialized edifice that has so effectively contained and restricted Black life chances. So I think here in this work, Iden's really getting at, we have like created this huge wall and boundary that these things can exist. And so that song then gets trapped on the aesthetic and not considered fully the political, outside of thinking about it as communication, when it really is the political act. And so something that I'm using to kind of intervene in this thought is thinking about it as the otherwise, as removing and challenging this aesthetic political boundary. So using Crawley's definition of the otherwise from Black Pentecostal breath, otherwise as a word, otherwise possibilities as phrase, announces the fact of infinite alternatives to what is and what is about being, about existence, about ontology. But if infinite alternatives exist, if otherwise possibilities a resource that is never exhausted, what exists is but one of many. Otherwise possibilities exist alongside that which we can detect with our finite sensual capacities, or otherwise possibilities exist in the register of imagination. The epistemology through which sensual detection occurs, that is the ways we think of the world, has to be altered in order to get at what's out there. And so really something that's like motivating this work is thinking about the scenes that happen. And so this is one early on about a scene from, and this is written as a SNCC Field Secretary Charles Sherrod used to send, of course, messages back. And so this is one of the earlier ones he sent back in Albany. The church was packed before 8 o'clock. People were everywhere in the aisles, sitting and standing in the choir stands, hanging over the railing of the balcony, sitting in the trees outside the windows. When the last speaker among the students, Bertha Gober, had finished, there was nothing left to say. Tears filled the eyes of hard-grown men who had seen with their own eyes merciless atrocities committed. Bertha told of spending Thanksgiving in jail, and we rose to sing We Shall Overcome. Nobody could imagine what kept the church on four corners. I threw my head back and closed my eyes as I sang with my whole body. And so something that really drew me to this moment is thinking about the embodiment of freedom that comes in the singing and the collectiveness of it, that is also a political practice, and being like the collective as being the thing that's most important. This is an actual scene from one of the meetings in Albany. Is used a lot in thinking about meetings in general when you come to thinking about freedom. And so something that I'm like led by in thinking about Bernice Johnson Reagan, who is a singer activist that comes out of the Albany movement. She's written a lot. She's considered a carrier of freedom songs. She created the group Sweet Honey in the Rock. Is this question of how can you know the political, social, and economic range of a community if you don't know how their signature, their identity with their soundings? And so sound is necessary. Song is necessary when we're thinking about how do we study who we study. And so a lot of this is in, of course, infra-political status, thinking through what is exactly happening on the ground among the people while organizations are organizing. And again, this is a sort of quotes from Andrew Young, from when King. So King shows up in Albany in December of 1961 at the request of the local coalition and not SNCC. So again, adding to like that, kind of like they were not on the same page. And so at December 1961 was following, of course, that November, folks had gotten arrested, students had gotten arrested, and they had ran out of money. And so they needed King to come. And so King comes. But what happens though, is even across the memory of folks, this is how they remember Albany is in song. So specifically paying attention here, somehow through the music, a great secret was discovered that Black people, otherwise cowed, discouraged, and faced with innumerable and inseparable obstacles, could transcend all those difficulties and forge a new determination, a new faith and strength when fortified with song. The music was not a political or economic gift to the people from the authorities, nor could it be taken away by them. Music was the gift of the people to themselves, a bottomless reservoir of spiritual power. And so a group that comes out of this are the Freedom Singers, which are originally started by Cordell Reagan and Bernice Johnson at this time. They eventually go to get married, and Rutha Harris, and Bertha Gober. And so really they embody this otherwise, and they travel, right? So they go to make money for SNCC. They become the SNCC Freedom Singers. They travel north, they tell the story of what's happening across the South in song for about 5 years before the original group, at least, before they split off and go do different things. And a lot of these folks continue to sing. Rutha Harris actually still sings in Albany at the Civil Rights Institute every second Saturday of every month since 1999, and she's 85. And so these people are still with us operating. But something else that really has drawn me to this case is Bernice Johnson Reagan says, "We became visible, our image enlarged when the sound of the freedom songs filled all the space." So there's this sense of like being seen, even though what they're really doing is being heard. And so just like leaving that kind of just like in the back of your mind when thinking about song and the use of it. And so how does this continue? Through Bernice, it continues in the formation of her group, Sweet Honey in the Rock, which is an a cappella women's group, but she says it's not a group, this is something I discovered in doing this research, right? I've seen them perform, but think of Sweet Honey as a woman born out of struggle and union of Black women singers. And then also makes singing with Sweet Honey in the Rock is an ongoing experiment. It's centering, expansive, and unlimiting learning experience. And it makes Sweet Honey a concert a more affirming, echoing place for the human spirit moving through this widely varied world. And so really what I get into in the paper is kind of like 5 key points. So thinking about song as a public language in action, song as a living testament and legacy, song defying political failure, song as linguistic wealth, and song as blurring collective deliverance and political self-determination. I don't know if I have time. I would love to share with you all like a brief singing by Rutha Harris and her brother of We'll Never Turn Back, which was a song that is the title of this paper, but also written by Bertha Gober, an NAACP youth council member in Albany, Georgia, and member of Reverend George Lee, an NAACP leader who was murdered in Mississippi, along with Lamar Smith in 1955 because they refused to take their names off the registration of voter lists. Bertha Gober, though, from Albany, writes this, and this becomes kind of a theme song that they hum, that they sing over and over again during the Albany campaign. So I'll just share like a little bit of it to stay on time.
We band Buchanan, we band scorned, we band talked about, shows you born, but we'll never turn back. cried for those like me who died for you, and he died for me. Died for the cause of equality.
So thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Claire. I'll just make a few comments, and then, matter of fact, let me go backwards with what's most fresh in our mind, and then back to the top. But there'll just be a brief. Oh, let me time myself. And then I'll integrate. I see a question in the chat. I'll integrate that into it. So here we go. We'll start with Claire Crawford. First of all, thank you all for your presentations. Excellent presentations. Okay, so Claire Crawford paper. The paper reads so nicely. It's like a melody itself as I'm reading it. So I enjoyed that. But I would say there's a different Claire Crawford who came here, because what you presented actually it sounded to me in many ways it's different. Now it's not either or, but it the expediency, I think, of having to do it the way you're doing it, it just made it a lot more effective for me. But maybe I'm just impatient. I won't even let hair grow on my head. So, but when you started off, because you said when failure isn't the end, that's the story, you know what I'm saying? But you don't have a heading like that in the paper. But when failure isn't the end, I'm like, yeah, you got me immediately, Sister Claire. And then when you said how they were working at cross purposes, that was so instructive right away. Because, and then you brought in what the white supremacists did to make it appear like it's, I forgot your word for it, it's a kinder white supremacism, you know, because it is looked upon as a failure, but because it's a failure, I would want you to consider that when failure isn't the end, you get them right up front. Because when I saw Albany too, that's what jumped out to me. That was a failure, how she's gonna make use of this. Okay, and then how they're working cross purpose. And then you mentioned Sweet Honey in the Right, and oh my goodness. So you know this book, on women in Africa and the African diaspora, because Sister Reagan got a chapter in here, and I cite her in the work that I'm doing on the diaspora. So you had me there once I saw you in there, but it's intertwined so nicely, and I would really like to see, because it's melodic what you've written and the way you bring in the lyrics and stuff. So I wouldn't want. I'm not suggesting either or. But the way you present it right today, when failure isn't the end, and you began with that, so many beautiful ironies, twists like that. I would hope you could bring some of that into the writing, or maybe in different outlets when you think about how you target it. But thanks for sharing that so much. Okay, Allison Baymer's piece. This is interesting as well. I'm struck too how you bring in the intersectionality when I hear workers co-ops. And this is interesting, and you grounded it in the history. I think that's excellent, and the literature you grounded it in. So I didn't get a chance to read this paper, so I'm just responding to what I saw. What I would want you to develop more is, and you started it, but maybe you'll have more time now in response. And I want to see how you dealt with the issues of how the co-ops themselves can replicate patterns of white supremacism, and you do broach this. But I'd like you to say more about that. And also, you mentioned you talk about the intersectionality of it, but I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. When I say how the co-op replicates patterns of white supremacism, and how do you challenge white supremacism without challenging white supremacism? And this goes back to the challenge and opportunities provided by intersectional approaches. But intersectional approaches require then that we engage at least these issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, within the, I'm trying to avoid saying solutions, within the resolutions of the challenges that we're dealing with. I'm trying to avoid saying problems we're dealing with. So I'm interested in that. And I'm also interested in, and you started to address it. I was writing the method you're using is often, and it may be just because you're starting this off, but it's more rhetorical than substantive, it seems to me, when you're saying what these folks are saying they're doing, but what are they doing substantively? You do address this when you talk about ownership, okay? But what about these other, and you talk about a range of status outcomes as well. their positions and et cetera. But what about with respect to their material well-being? How is it effective that? And even how is it affecting with respect to their returns on their investment in the co-op? So in very material ways, I'd like to hear more about that. But I do think what I'm referring to is rhetorical. I don't mean that in the negative way. It's just purely descriptive. That may be a necessary starting point as you delve into these more substantive areas, I think. The Shamya Hutchinson paper, I shared with you, and I also shared with oh, I'm black. Was it Claire? I shared with you the piece by Joe Street on the culture wars, because he talks about the SNCC freedom singers. I forgot to mention that, but that was another one who talked about that. And he has some interesting work on Huey Newton as well. Just the cross-pollination of his work, I think, will be interesting to you. The Shamya Hutchinson piece, I shared with you the information about Ruby McCullum, and Ruby McCullum, who's going to kill her white rapist, who was a state senator in Florida, I think in Live Oak in Florida there. And the dark end of the street, the Danielle McGuire's piece on Rosa Parks's in organizing with respect to rape before the Montgomery bus boycott. And I wanted to ask you if Tarana, I believe Tarana Burke was part of MXG, the Malcolm X grassroots movement in Philly. If you could say something about that, especially since you're right there in Lincoln. And then I just want to share with Alison I want to give you all the opportunity to respond to that, but I want to integrate into the Alison one because there was an early question. A question for Alison. You've done a wonderful job with conceptualizing co-ops as alternatives to traditional labor constructs that are profoundly hierarchical and racialized. In your opinion, is there interesting variation within co-ops that you've identified, for example, language, identities of co-op managers, neighborhood location, et cetera, that you think explains the decrease in worker exploitation? And I also want to add to Claire, so you have to write these down now, to Claire, how would you say that music and sound is used in youth activism? Okay, so that's what we have. And let's privilege Shamya, who's been waiting the longest. Okay, in our responses, and it's 4:48, so we have about 12 minutes in the response. So please, if you would, Shamya Hutchinson.
I believe you asked, was Tarana Burke involved in what movement was it?
The Malcolm X grassroots movement in Philadelphia.
I'm not completely sure, but I do know that she was involved way before the Me Too movement, before it became mainstream. So I know that she most likely was doing work around this way before the Me Too movement became a mainstream activism-based group. So that is what I know from that information.
So just go backwards, and then Allison Baymer, and then Claire Crawford, if you would, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this super helpful feedback, and Bianca for your questions. So I can try to respond to that quickly. And my analysis is preliminary and pretty strictly constrained to the as Errol, as you said, the rhetoric on the websites. However, I have collected, so Berkeley put out a couple of years ago, data on census tract level segregation in the Bay Area. And so I've done some preliminary analysis that essentially maps the addresses of the co-ops that I studied to that data. And some early results show that it is tracking the co-ops that use this intersectional type of race class language are occurring in areas of higher segregation. And in fact, that tracks with a lot of the work that Jessica Gordon-Nembard has done that says that these will arise out of social closure and restrictions to traditional markets. Some other patterns that I've observed, as I alluded to, and when I was discussing quickly my findings, is that almost all of the co-ops, the 11 that I presented, are owned by Black workers or workers of color. So these types of patterns they weren't largely showing up in co-ops that weren't explicit about the demographics of their workers. However, I do have to caveat, there's a lot of folks just aren't going to prioritize putting language on their websites, rightfully so, because they're running a worker business. So I think there's a severe limitation in data there. I've also done some very early analysis on the individual, the census, the democracy at work, And to answer, I think one of the questions, Errol, that you brought up about how this replicates patterns of racial hierarchy and white supremacy, very early analysis, I'm seeing that so the census interviews worker co-ops all over the US, members of worker co-ops, and I'm finding that Black workers and workers of color are reporting, even when they are technically owners of the businesses, they're reporting feeling less like owners than their white counterparts. So I think that speaks to a larger story that a lot of like Black thinkers who have touched on cooperatives throughout history have picked up, that this is a phenomenon that is out of racial solidarity, and that multiracial co-ops cause quite a bit of problems for this type of structure sometimes. So early results there, but thank you very much for the feedback. It's super helpful.
Okay, thank you. Please, Claire.
Yeah, no, this is also something that I think about a lot. I think it operates in similar ways. I've been writing a lot about trap music in various capacities, and thinking about the lack of, I think something that happens more now than ever is that we choose what gets to be political or not. When I think something that happened during civil rights is they were taking songs from everywhere, right? Like, so like Ray Charles' Hit the Road Jack becomes like Hit the Road Segregation, right? And like are changing like gospel songs and words of that. And so I think that still happens. And chanting in that capacity still happens. Like in LA over, I think it was in December, mostly like November, December, when Black Lives Matter LA was protesting outside of the mayor's house, they basically created like a Migos flow chant about like houseless populations. And so you get these kind of like adaptations that are still continuing. I think now though we do have, particularly when it comes to hip hop, there is like, this is political or that is not, that I think can kind of like discourage people. I think that fact that church is not the centering anymore, I think was what makes it interesting and harder for folks to recognize how music uses, right? Because a lot of times we use gospel music in this era to be like the centering of it. But I think it continues in a similar way of where music and sound is resistance. Black music and sound is just resistance by existence. And so it's been adapted. It changes. People come up with stuff on the spot. It's rhythmic. It's catchy. And you know, like that's just is what it is, right?
I meant to ask, I'm sorry, Kelly, did you have a question or comment you want to add?
No, I did not. But I really appreciate everyone's questions. But actually I do. For Allison, going into, so as you were saying that most of the co-ops were owned by African Americans, right? So, and your title for the paper is Working Cooperatives as a Challenge. So my question is, have you thought of this as a way of resistance? And what type of like, what language kind of are you using to uphold the challenge so forth? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, actually the abstract that I submitted for the conference used resistance, I think, rather than challenge. And as I got deeper into the literature, especially Gordon Nembhard's work, challenge seemed a bit, I don't think it works better, but it just reflects more of this, it's long-term and sustainable, and that the wealth creation that's occurring within the workers in the workplace, but then is being redistributed to the community. So when a workplace isn't sending profits out to shareholders that exist, you know, usually on coasts, or they're not living in the community. So these co-ops are not doing that. They're instead reinvesting all of that money, the profits, back into the workers and back directly into the community. So I suppose challenge in a way, I don't think it does a better job than resistance, but I was trying to convey that this work in a way encompasses individuals' everyday lives. I found a statistic, we on average spend over 1,700 hours a year working. So it encompasses our lives as individuals, but then it's deeply grounding and also deeply disruptive to communities when it's exploitative and dangerous, like it usually is. So no, I think resistance and thinking really deeply about that as a concept is certainly a way that I should go. Thank you.
Are there further questions from the audience? Just unmute yourself and ask. If the questions from the audience, you can just unmute yourself and ask. Okay, if there aren't, then I would like to ask the authors too. Is there something in your presentation that you wish you could have gotten to, but you couldn't because you got this bald head chair who's just a stickler for time and stuff, but something that you wanted to share that you didn't, even in your experience in doing this type of research and doing this type of research where you're located at? Anyone?
I actually have a question for Claire. So I've faced a lot of pushback within the department that I'm in on convincing people that work is political. And you're saying song is political, which doesn't seem contestable at all in the way that you seems very reasonable and in fact inherently political. I'm just wondering you're at USC, if you've faced pushback for defining song as political and how you've responded to that.
Yeah, no, I think like that's definitely started out as a thing. Not so much now because I'm going to write my dissertation basically from this kind of like subject matter. Yeah, there's a lot of pushback. I think just like exploring what different notions of the political is and expanding it and just like having to do that work for myself first. And so it took about a year for me to convince even my chair, who is Dr. Anshmi Hancock Alfaro, and she's really like cool with what I'm doing now. But definitely at first it was like, all right, you're gonna write about song, all right, like go do that. And I just came back and having done the work a little bit more. And so like what you see, like when I get this presentation a year ago, definitely was not this. So it was me connecting it to something that I know, like when the failure isn't the end part, really hook them in, right? So you use something that they can identify as political science and they're like, all right. And then you're like, okay, song is a thing now. Like that's basically what happened. It was just kind of like hook them in with something they could identify and then like connected it to what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Sister Claire, I just saw you doing something just ironic. You're just sitting you're in front of the folks and you're saying, there's some question about whether songs are political. In the background, you have Wagner, the Ride of the Valkyrie going on. Few would argue that Wagner is political. Just have that going on. Say, I don't know if song is political. I don't know. I understand people will ask. So use the irony of it. And I get that in your presentation and your style of writing is very versatile as well. And I'd like to know as well, Shamya, as you're writing and you're an undergrad at Lincoln, is that right?
Yes.
That is wonderful. Who's encouraged you to do this type of work and to come and present at a conference like this, like at INCOAS?
So to do this type of work, I've been inspired by just what I've been through on my campus and what I've seen. Sexual violence is a very underrepresented topic and people don't want to touch it at all. So just showing up for my community and people who have been through what I've been through is really important for me. And who encouraged me to come here and actually present was my UCI HBCU fellowship, where I was able to go through my research and they were able to help me kind of synthesize my thoughts over the summer, where we were in the height of the abolitionist model for defunding the police. So that really informed the way I speak about how police brutality and sexual violence are very connected. So I just look forward to continuing doing that work and being able to be more pivotal in the movement.
And I really appreciate that. There's a book by Nan Woodruff, and there's there's a sister who I'm blocking her name, I'm sorry. And they actually combine this and talk about the police brutality and sexual violence, how the police patrols in Mississippi that would target young Black girls for rape. And so these were not this police brutality using rape. And also this is Nan Woodruff's work, and I'll send you the reference to it and something else. Oh, I'm about to block on it. That when you just, oh yeah, are you familiar with the "Don't Be That Guy" the advertisements that they use called "Don't Be That Guy"? They started in Vancouver. They put these big billboards, and they would show, so for example, a woman in a cocktail dress, splayed out on her stomach on a couch with a drink next to her, and it says, "This is not yes," or "This is not consent." So they said, why are we targeting girls and women for rape? Most rapists are men and boys. So the ad was "Don't Be That Guy." And it showed reductions in the number of reported incidents of rape where these billboards were signed. It's called Don't Be That Guy. And at the end of each week of the first week in my classes, no matter the subject, I put that up because we know on college campuses, the first week in back, high incidence of sexual assault. And but I'm going to send that to you. And any reference I refer to, please just send me an email. And we have each other's email, so we can do this as well. Thank you all for coming out. We have to go. It's 5 o'clock, so the next folks come up. Thank you for wonderful presentations, Shamya, Hutchinson, Allison Baymer, Claire Crawford, and all of those who attended, and Kelly Richardson. Thank you so much. Okay, take care.
Thank you.